"Ma'am, drop the rifle," the officer yelled. I didn't move. I stood there, dead still, holding up my hunting license and federal ID while wearing bright orange. About 30 feet away, crouching behind a pine tree like a scared deer with a phone, was the self-appointed HOA president of our neighborhood, Margaret Devlin. She was calling 911 again because I was hunting ducks on my own land. What she didn't know, and what she absolutely should have researched before trying this stunt, was that I wasn't just licensed. I trained the very agent she just called on me. And when I was done with her and her imaginary authority, her entire HOA kingdom wouldn't exist anymore. The officer's hands were up like I was some fugitive from a B-list action movie. You know the type. Misunderstood anti-hero, tactical gear, surrounded by cops because some suburban busybody thought a duck call meant imminent war. "My license is in my left hand," I said calmly. "My badge is in my wallet. You want me to move?" The younger cop looked mortified. To his credit, he holstered his weapon the second he caught sight of my ID. The older one took a beat longer. He looked at me again, his brow wrinkled. Then it hit him. "Ty Bennett?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said, not even trying to hide the smirk. Behind the tree, Margaret peeked out like a raccoon caught tipping over a trash can. "Let me guess," I said, glancing toward the pine. "Margaret called this in again?" The officer nodded like a man who's eaten the same bad burrito twice and hopes this time it won't give him food poisoning. To be absolutely clear, I wasn't even on HOA property. I was in a duck blind my uncle had built 20 years ago on our family's lakefront lot, a parcel that predates the neighborhood by 6 decades. I had every legal right to be there. I wasn't anywhere near the HOA's so-called playground, which consisted of a rusted swing set and a plastic sign that said "No unsupervised children," which was ironic considering Margaret patrolled it like a clipboard-wielding toddler. This wasn't the first time she'd called in shots fired, when she heard a 12-gauge echo through the trees. But it was the first time I let it play out instead of just calling the sheriff to defuse it. The officer radioed in that the threat was a licensed federal wildlife field instructor conducting a routine duck hunt on private property. Dispatch's reply was an audible groan. "Oh God, is it Margaret again?" The younger cop cracked a smile, then chuckled and holstered his sidearm fully. I could tell he wanted to ask what it was like dealing with her regularly. I considered handing him a beer and a duck decoy as a sympathy gift. Once the cruiser rolled away, Margaret emerged from her hiding spot like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama she wrote herself. Neon windbreaker, oversized sunglasses, and that self-righteous air of authority no one ever gave her. "You're endangering the children," she barked, hands on hips, like I had just set a fire in the sandbox. "What children?" I asked, scanning the empty cul-de-sac. "It's 6:30 a.m. and 34 degrees. The ducks are out. The kids are inside eating Lucky Charms." She shook her head and muttered something about the HOA board, hearing about this. I waved and replied, "Can't wait," in the same tone I use when writing a fine for someone fishing without a license. 2 days later, I found an envelope jammed in my mailbox, not mailed, just stuffed. Inside was a $2,500 fine from the HOA for unauthorized firearms activity endangering residents. It was printed in Comic Sans and had a clip art duck with a red X over it. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Attached was a map with a red line drawn in sharpest circling my property and labeling it Future HOA Expansion Zone. I could picture Margaret hunched over her kitchen table with a ruler, a vengeance playlist, and a fantasy about HOA conquest. Here's the thing. My land was never part of the HOA. Not now, not ever. My deed explicitly exempts my property from any future HOA annexation. But Margaret had decided if she just redrew the lines herself, I'd magically fall under her lawn chair dictatorship. I mailed a copy of my deed, the county parcel map, and my federal exemption paperwork to the HOA's P.O. box with a polite note. "Please remove me from your records. Your authority does not extend to my land. Sincerely, Ty Bennett." 3 days later, I got my letter back, shredded, stuffed inside a manila envelope with a sticky note that said, "We'll see about that." Smiley face. I figured she'd escalate. I just didn't expect how. When I went down to my dock the following weekend, coffee in hand, I was ready for a peaceful morning. What I found was a sign posted at the edge of my lakefront. "No trespassing private HOA waters. No firearms. No fishing. No boating. Authorized by M. Devlin." I stared at it like it had grown out of the ground. My lake, where I'd fished since I could hold a rod, was now apparently her private reserve. And she'd signed her name at the bottom like she was queen of the wetlands. I took photos of the sign, of the shifted property markers, of the metal cable she laid across the public access ramp. This was no longer a nuisance. It was now criminal tampering. I sent the photos to Officer Jenna Ruiz, who'd been dealing with Margaret for years. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. "You want the short version or the fun version?" she asked. I leaned against the dock rail, sipping my coffee. "Give me the fun one. You've got enough here for a formal investigation," she said. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think it's time we finally take the gloves off. That made me smile. I poured another cup and started typing up a formal complaint. Margaret had no idea who she'd picked a fight with. I wasn't just a guy with a duck blind. I trained federal agents. I helped write half the operating procedures her so-called authority violated. She thought she could redraw borders with a Sharpie and some clip art signs. What she didn't realize was that she'd just declared war on someone who knows the law better than anyone in this county, and certainly better than she ever would. But she wasn't done. 2 days later, she called 911 again, this time claiming I was building a suspicious wildlife laboratory in my shed. I wish I were joking. That morning, I woke up to the sound of a power drill. Still in flannel, half a slice of toast in my mouth, I followed the noise down the trail behind my dock. And there she was, Margaret, along with her sidekick, Doug, a lanky, nervous-looking man who always seemed 2 seconds from bailing. They were hammering another sign into the ground. This one read, "Neighborhood Wildlife Preserve. No hunting, no fishing, no unauthorized entry. Violators will be fined." Doug looked like he wanted to disappear into the earth. Margaret, however, had the smugness of someone who thought a laminated sign gave her federal jurisdiction. I leaned against a tree. "Didn't realize the Department of the Interior certified you, Margaret. This is a community project," she said proudly. "We've had several complaints about unsafe wildlife activity. The HOA has voted to designate this area as a protected preserve." "On land you don't own?" I asked, blinking slowly. "That's been legally zoned as hunting land since 1953? "We tried to notify you," she said sweetly. "You've been uncooperative." That almost made me laugh. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. She tried to hide her face behind her clipboard. Doug froze mid-hammer like a statue. "You know that placing false signage on private land is illegal, right?" I said, panning the camera between the sign and her. "Especially signs that contradict state and federal land use designations." "This is a gray area," she scoffed. "We're protecting the children." Still no children in sight. Just squirrels and one really confused woodpecker. "Margaret," I said calmly, "the only child in danger is the one who gets caught in that snare you set by my dock last week." That made her flinch. She didn't know I had found it. But I had pictures. It was a homemade trap, poorly disguised and dangerous. They packed up and left shortly after that, but not before she hissed something about taking it to the regional council, which I assumed meant the Facebook group she ran like a suburban monarchy. The next morning, a drone flew over my cabin. Not a toy drone. A low-hovering, slow-sweeping surveillance drone. It buzzed over my shed, hovered for a minute, then zipped off, right back to Margaret's backyard. That crossed a line. I called Officer Ruiz again. She sighed. "You want to file the report now," she said, "or wait until she tries to build a moat around your cabin?" "I'll start gathering evidence," I replied. And that's exactly what I did. I set up trail cameras. Timestamped everything. I even got audio of Margaret bragging during an HOA meeting about boxing in the duck hunter, so she could seize control of the lakefront. Doug, bless him, was starting to squirm. He was the one who anonymously sent me the recording. No name, but metadata doesn't lie. The next day, I received another citation, this time for unsafe storage of hazardous materials. Apparently, my shed, filled with decoys, bait, and a bow was a national threat now. The citation ended with a threat. "If not addressed, this matter will be escalated to county and federal review." At that point, I realized something. She wasn't just trying to hassle me. She wanted me to snap, lose my temper, give her something she could twist into a restraining order and play victim. But I don't snap. I teach conflict de-escalation for a living. So I sat down, poured myself a drink, and wrote 3 letters, one to the HOA's insurance carrier, one to the county land office, and one to my federal contacts. All documented, all professional. Then came her biggest mistake yet. Margaret called 911 again, this time reporting that someone had entered my shed with a barrel of chemicals, and that she heard metallic clanging consistent with bomb making. The county must have been out of patience, because they sent a full hazmat team and fire unit. I was splitting firewood when they pulled up. Lights on. Sirens blaring. Ready for Armageddon. Officer Ruiz arrived minutes later, fuming. I calmly handed over the key to my shed. Inside, a tackle box, 3 duck decoys, a thermos, and a pack of energy bars. One fireman held up the thermos and said, "Maybe hazardous caffeine levels." Ruiz turned to Margaret, who had crept back to the property line. "You're done," she said. "You've now filed multiple false emergency reports." "That's criminal." Margaret sputtered. "I was just trying to protect the community." Ruiz pointed to the thermos. "Lady, the most dangerous thing in there is expired jerky." But Margaret wasn't done. That evening, I found something even worse. Near the trail, I spotted a thin wire buried under leaves. Following it, I found a motion sensor, a flashing red light, and a Wi-Fi transmitter zip-tied to a tree branch. A surveillance device. On my land. I pulled the SD card. The footage? It had audio of Margaret instructing Doug on where to hide the equipment. She thought calling it a private security effort would shield her from liability. She thought wrong. The next morning, I walked into the county records office with a folder that could have stopped a truck. Drone footage, photos of tampered markers, citations, emails, audio, timestamps, even HOA newsletters with her name on the fake finds. I dropped it on the desk of Marcy Sutherland, the county's land supervisor, a no-nonsense woman who hates HOA drama more than traffic court. She flipped through the file, paused, and muttered, "This is going to ruin someone's weekend." I smiled. "That's the idea." Marcy informed me that Margaret's signs, especially the ones claiming my lakefront was a wildlife preserve, violated 3 local ordinances and at least 1 state conservation statute. Worse, she had inadvertently tampered with a state-designated conservation easement that had been in place for decades, which meant she hadn't just broken HOA rules. She had violated state environmental protection laws. I asked Marcy if she'd be willing to submit a formal statement. She grinned. "I'll staple it to her next fake fine if you want." With county paperwork now moving, I called in a federal favor. My supervisor at the Wildlife Enforcement Division, who once joked that I had the patience of a monk and the grudge of a dragon, agreed to fly out for an on-site review. He brought our regional legal officer, Lisa Grant, a woman with the calm authority of someone who once cited a congressman for illegal trapping. We toured the property. I showed them the signs, the tampered markers, the hidden devices, the camera footage. And then we heard shouting from the trail. Margaret had spotted us. She stormed over, hair frizzed, windbreaker flapping like a cape, barking about environmental instability, unauthorized construction, and her duty as chair of the Neighborhood Environmental Integrity Board, which, as far as I could tell, existed only in her imagination. Lisa asked her plainly, "Ma'am, are you aware you've just admitted, on record, to interfering with protected conservation land?" Margaret blinked. "I didn't admit anything." Lisa tilted her head toward my phone, clearly recording. "You just did." Margaret's voice wobbled. "I was just trying to preserve the community." Lisa's voice didn't waver an inch. "You placed surveillance equipment on federally exempt land. You falsified boundary maps. You created fraudulent citations. That's not preservation. That's a felony." Margaret opened and closed her mouth like a goldfish in shock. We walked away, leaving her frozen there, arms limp, clipboard dangling like a broken sword. Back at my cabin, Lisa handed me a copy of the formal notice. The HOA was now under federal review, with recommendations sent to the state attorney general. My supervisor added dryly, "Depending on what else we find, this might trigger an audit of their charter and financials." I didn't need to smile. I just poured everyone black coffee. 2 days later, Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting. The flyer was titled "Community in Crisis." I showed up. Not invited, but not unwelcome. The clubhouse was half full. Folding chairs. Burnt popcorn smell. Margaret stood at the front, pointing to a blurry photo of me on a projector like she was trying to summon a witch hunt. "This man is destroying everything we built," she cried. "He's manipulating the law, endangering our values." I stood up slowly. "Hi, everyone. I'm Ty. I live next door. And I've got documentation proving your president has committed multiple crimes: land tampering, illegal surveillance, environmental violations. Your entire HOA is now under state and federal investigation. And every one of you could be held liable if you keep letting her speak for you." A murmur swept the room. Doug stood up too. "He's not lying," he said, voice hollow. "I helped. I didn't realize what we were doing was illegal. But I have the emails. The receipts. I can't be part of this anymore." Margaret turned to him like he'd stabbed her. "You coward," she hissed. "You don't care about the community." Doug looked down. "I care about not going to jail." The room shifted. Older residents got up and left. Someone asked if they could vote to suspend her. Another asked if the HOA even had legal insurance. They didn't. Margaret tried to regain control, but it was like watching a sandcastle melt in the tide. The panic had started. I didn't have to do anything else. Just let it collapse. The next day, Margaret filed a restraining order against me. It was denied before I finished my morning tea. The judge took one look at the evidence, emails, surveillance footage, official state complaints, and dismissed it outright. But the final twist? A local reporter called me. "Mind if I write a story?" she asked. "It's not every day a rogue HOA president triggers a federal audit." "Be my guest," I said. "Just spell her name right." A week after the HOA crumbled, I sat on my dock as a heron landed nearby. Calm. Unbothered. Unlike the neighborhood. News of the investigation spread. Thanks to Doug and a few brave residents, internal emails leaked. Footage from my trail cams circulated. People realized Margaret hadn't been protecting anyone. She'd been playing dictator with other people's money and fake authority. Neighbors started showing up at my door, not to complain, but to apologize. A retired couple brought me pie and a typed letter. A father of twins asked if I needed help removing any leftover signs. 3 board members privately messaged me, asking how to dissolve the HOA completely. The storm had passed. Lisa emailed me an update. Margaret was now the subject of a joint investigation by the State Conservation Office, County Land Division, and possibly the IRS. Someone had raised a very good question about what she'd done with the HOA dues. It sure hadn't gone to sidewalk repair. Then came the cherry on top. During the worst rainstorm of the year, the creek behind Margaret's house flooded. She'd always refused city-run drainage maintenance, insisting she could handle it herself. She couldn't. Her basement was the first to go. Then her garage. When emergency services arrived, they said she refused to evacuate until someone acknowledged her authority. They didn't. She was escorted out in soaked pajamas, muttering about lawsuits while standing ankle-deep in muddy water. I watched it from my dry porch, sipping tea. The irony was divine. After months of trying to redraw borders, silence ducks, and fake law, it wasn't me who brought her down. It was the very ground she claimed to control. Officer Ruiz stopped by the next morning with a box of donuts and a grin. "You made the front page again," she said. "So you running for HOA president of a non-existent HOA?" I laughed. "Nah, I'll stick to ducks. Less drama. Fewer legal threats." "You sure?" Could trademark the duck whisperer. I shook my head. Revenge is nice. Silence is better. As the sun rose over the lake, I realized something. I hadn't just won. I'd reclaimed something more valuable than property. My peace. My freedom. And a quiet corner of the world, no longer ruled by a clipboard and a delusion of power.